Welcome to my field. Happy World Soil Day. My colleagues and I here at the University of Sydney thought it would be a good idea to put together a SOILinar to celebrate this auspicious day. World Soil Day is obviously important for the soil scientists of the world. Welcome my colleagues from the International Union of Soil Sciences, but it's important for everyone, from kids to farmers to those people who are interested in gardening, who are interested in urban agriculture, rural agriculture. I welcome you all, and I hope there's something in this SOILinar for you. I guess there's a growing interest in biodiversity, particularly microbial biodiversity. We hear a lot about the soil microbiome, so we're going to hear a little bit about some of the work we've been doing here on measuring soil microbial diversity, but looking at its spatial pattern and seeing how that might relate to pedodiversity. We're all interested in food security, and people even talk about water security. Well, we're going to talk about the concept of soil security, how we secure our soil for the future. So we're going to hear about that concept, and then we're going to show you an example of how you can assess the concept quantitatively and with high resolution spatially for the island of Tasmania. Today, I believe the Global Soil Partnership of FAO is launching a global soil carbon map based on digital soil mapping principles. We will also show you some work that we've been doing on global soil carbon mapping at high resolution. The difference between our map product and the FAO Global Soil Carbon Map is that we are interested in soil carbon change over time. So we have, as part of our model, the idea of soil carbon change and what causes those changes. So we are developing a methodology for mapping that change over time, particularly over the last couple of decades. One of the most difficult issues if you're a soil scientist or if you're a lay person is that of soil classification. It's been an issue for a long time. The International Union of Soil Science has a working group on creating a universal soil classification, a new kind of classification. We're going to show you some of the work that we've been doing on that. The idea is not to create new classification systems, but to take the taxa of existing systems and sequentially add them to create an overall system, which might be a good candidate for a universal system. Digital soil mapping has become a very important technology, as evidenced by the fact that today we're launching the Global Soil Carbon Map. We've been developing a lot of training material and books and so on, and we want to tell you something about the material that we've developed. That training material is just part of our educational approach, and we'll talk to you about our approach to soil education. We've been thinking hard about how to get more of our science to users. So we've been working on a mobile phone app that measures soil structural stability. This is just one example of what we think of many apps that could be developed that can be used to take our basic soil science to users in many applications all over the world. So we've got quite a few different topics. I hope you enjoy them. See you at the end.
Hello soil lovers out there, very happy World Soil Day for all of us. What better than celebrate this day talking about the importance of our soil on sustaining life and what makes us here at the University of Sydney full compromise to ensure its security. Indeed, we took perhaps one of the most difficult goals in soil science, to assess and understand from a global view the most unknown and challenging of the soil components, soil biodiversity. There are endless contributions of soil biota that allow soil functionality and therefore soil ecosystem services. Soil biodiversity ensures these services since soil organisms regulate geochemical processes and soil physical conditions. The simplest example is the fact that the breakdown of organic components is only possible by soil-living organisms. At the same time, the ability and capacity of each soil to perform this function and then maintain those nutrients over time depends on the diversity and composition of those living communities. Thus, soil organic carbon and carbon sequestration are importantly affected by these communities. In order to protect and improve these and other soil functions, we require to assess them at global level. This means to build the big picture for the policymakers. As such, soil scientists began more than 25 years ago mapping all of the soils around the world and creating global soil maps using digital approaches. Over the last decade, these mapping techniques has been improved and refined that allow us today a global assessing of the soil organic carbon and soil biodiversity. It is worthy to mention that 2 or 3 decades ago, we weren't able to explore soil biodiversity at such a global scale. And it's only these days that biomolecular techniques and next-generation technologies are opening the opportunity to see uncultured organisms in record time by decoding soil DNA. Here, we took this opportunity, and using this technology and new advances in mapping techniques, we started our first exploration of the spatial parallels between soil microbial patterns and soil global distribution. We used the state of New South Wales in Australia as our study area, since it is as large as many other countries around the globe, but especially because of the extent and orthogonality of its environmental gradients that creates a useful experimental design. Then, on the basis of 2 orthogonal transects of more than 1,000 kilometers each, and taking into consideration different land uses and ecosystems, we assessed and found out a close relationship between soil spatial distribution and soil microbial diversity patterns. Nonetheless, our principal finding is the fact that this relationship extended beyond specific soil properties, but interesting to soil taxonomic levels. This highlights the closest parallels between soil biodiversity and pedodiversity at global scales. We look forward to making this information useful to protect those soil processes that rely directly on soil biodiversity, thus give a step forward to secure our soils. Thanks for listening and sharing this day with us. Happy Soil Day, and see you next time.
G'day. Soil is everywhere, and we like to classify it because it gives us an idea of the kinds of things we can do with it. The farmer usually knows what he's doing, but nowadays with science, we can lend the farmer a bit of a hand. Scientific investigation can be done in the field, but often the process starts with soil cores. Someone who knows what he's doing can have a look at this soil core and identify layers. Then you can actually take samples from a specific part of that layer and identify attributes like clay, sand, silt and pH. So we can get all of those soil properties and roll them up into a classification system. That's actually quite easy to do. In fact, we have dozens of different classifications that we can roll that single soil core into. Here's an example of a world classification system. And over here is an example of some soils from an Australian classification system. Now, the trick is to get this to work with this.
Step 1. We need to have standard sets of soil attributes at different depths. Now, step 2. We need to find a way to scale and convert all the standard soil attributes into a common space using some magic. We call it PCA transformation. And as you can see, the result can be viewed in this three-dimensional diagram. If you look into this diagram, some parts of the diagram are more crowded, while some other parts have big holes. Then we need to thin this diagram by measuring the distance between the soils. Now, if an unknown soil is given to us, we would want to know how it relates to the soil that are already in the system. By using the computer equivalent of a tape measure, we can plot this new soil into the new space and figure out how close this unknown is to others. We can either tell you what this unknown soil is most similar to in terms of the existing system, or if the distance between the unknown and the rest of the soil is beyond a certain value, we can say this unknown needs to be added to the group.
If we can create a system by adding soil types from systems all over the world, and we can get some kind of agreement between scientific communities, then we have a real candidate for a universal classification system.
Hi, I'm Stacey Patterson, here at the Sydney Institute of Agriculture with two of my favourite researchers from the Institute. Could you please introduce yourselves?
Hi, my name is Budiman Minasni. I'm a professor in soil landscape modelling here at the University of Sydney. My research is trying to find out why soil varies in space, or what controls that soil so that it changes in space and over time. This is in a broad term what we call as pedometrics, and I also do digital soil mapping.
Hi there, I'm Brendan Malone. I'm a researcher here at in the Institute. My research is around the digital soil mapping space, the soil spectroscopy space, and just in general in the pedometric space here within the Institute.
So can you explain in a little bit more detail what digital soil mapping is?
So digital soil mapping simply is an automated way of making soil maps, or the modern way of soil maps. So traditionally to make soil maps, people have to, or surveyor have to go out in the field and look at the landscape, and then they come back in their lab, and based on the satellite imagery or the topography, they're going to delineate manually what they think the soil will be in the landscape. So in digital soil mapping, we try to automate this process.
Yes, it's a computer assisted process, taking observations, some soil observations, and coupling that together with some remote sensed information, terrain elevation model information, and then combining all that data into a model framework, so that we can take our observations and then estimate soil variation across space.
So why has this change towards digital soil mapping been important?
Yes, so digital soil mapping is really important, more so now than ever, because obviously soil is finite, and the pressures put on soil has become greater and greater over time with population increase and the demands for more food and more production from our soils. So therefore we need to have a much better indication, a better mapping of the status of our soils, and we need to have in place better ways to monitor the soils. So therefore digital soil mapping is really crucial to delivering that sort of information for better management.
So it allows a more precise map than traditional methods?
Yeah, we think it does. It gives you a bit more very localised predictions of soil information, whereas legacy soil data is quite vague and not very specific at a local scale. Digital soil mapping can give you that, and you can get some sort of estimate of the accuracy of your map, as well as some sort of measure of the uncertainty.
So what else can you use digital soil maps for?
So there are lots of use of digital soil maps. For example, at the COP21 a couple of years ago in Paris, there was an initiative from the Ministry of Agriculture of France to increase soil carbon by 4 per mil, or 0.4% every year. So in order to do that, we need to have a map of soil carbon stocks in the world, or the soil carbon stock at different regions, so that we can optimize how much carbon to be stored in the soil. And this is illustrated in Jose Padarian's presentation a while ago on the soil carbon in the world.
Yes, and also before in Damien's talk in regards to the soil security, where there's quite a large effort these days in terms of how we quantify soil security. And one example of this is to assess the productivity of soils, how they can produce biomass for food production and for fibre production. The example there is in Tasmania, where we've had a large project over the last few years in terms of quantifying the soil's productivity to support a number of agricultural enterprises, from cropping enterprises through to horticultural enterprises such as wine grapes, hazelnuts, for example. So essentially, for that type of analysis, you need to have digital soil mapping that can inform you the suitability for those types of enterprises.
So you can use digital soil maps to save the world or to feed the planet?
Both.
So do you offer training in digital soil mapping?
Yes, we offer training in Australia and all over the world. So we have traveled all around the world, from in Europe, North America, and Asia to do the training.
Yes, our workshops are 2 to 3 days, or could be more. These are hands-on workshops with a lot of interaction between us as presenters and the students, and hands-on in that the students or the people that come along to our workshops are sitting in front of a computer, and we're going through with them exercises on all sorts of things related to digital soil mapping.
So it's an interactive learning process?
Completely, yeah. So it's really important that students are given a hands-on feel, or given some real data sets to play with, so that they can sort of better understand, like the concept of digital soil mapping is pretty clear, but how to apply that in a very practical manner is another thing. So it's really important for us to sort of here's some data, here's some examples of a workflow of digital soil mapping, and then it becomes an easy way to sort of learn and for the students to understand.
So I understand that you've written a book about digital soil mapping and how to apply digital soil mapping using R. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, sure, Stacey. This is our book, using R for digital soil mapping, and we published this with Puttyman and Alex McBratney, and this was published earlier this year. And indeed, it's a course or a curriculum in how to do digital soil mapping. In this case, using R.
So this book complements the course that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, definitely. So, like from all of our workshops that we've ran over the last number of years, we've compiled a number of exercises and materials from those workshops. And essentially, this book is a compilation of all those exercises and materials. So it's more or less a one-stop shop for all digital soil mapping. So digital soil mapping isn't just one thing. Not such about creation of digital soil maps. It's a whole group of exercises and workflows.
And the book is called Using R for Digital Soil Mapping. Why do you use R?
Yeah, well, I think R is very general. It's very user-friendly. For digital soil mapping, there's three things that you want to do. So you want to do some data analysis, you want to do some GIS sorts of exercises, and you want to create some maps. And all those things and more can be done in R. And because it's a relatively easy sort of computer programming language to learn, that makes digital soil mapping pretty easy and pretty straightforward, and that you can get everything in one software.
So for anyone who's watching who's interested in using R for their own digital soil mapping, where can they get access to these codes?
Yes, you can get all the codes in this book in our website. It's called www.digitalsoilmapping.com. So where you can download all the codes and use it for your own mapping.
Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing the exciting world of digital soil mapping and how we can use it to make better maps, feed the world and save the planet.
Yeah. Thanks, Stacey. Yeah, get mapping and using R for digital soil mapping.
Hello, I'd like to give you a bit of information about the project we've been working on here for the last few years. It's partly funded by the Grains Research and Development Corporation and of course the university. Over the recent years there's become an increasing interest in soil science education in the grains industry, primarily for advisors to the industry who are perceived to need a little bit more knowledge with respect to soils problems that are confronting the industry. While soil science education continues in various tertiary institutions in Australia, there's an increasing demand for education at the advisor level, where specific issues of interest to farmers need more soil knowledge than is apparently available at the moment. Our project was to develop potentially undergraduate or in-service training curricula in soil science, primarily aimed at benefiting the advisors to the industry. Stakeholders at various meetings we held to define the teaching material gave quite specific information that they did not think traditional tertiary education models were appropriate for in-service training for advisors, partly because of time commitments and expense. After lengthy consultations with stakeholders from the academic and advisor and soil science professional communities, it became clear that modification of existing tertiary programs was not going to be appropriate for the type of in-service advisor education we were looking at. The stakeholders advised us that very focused local information dealing with the problems that farmers face on the ground was what was required, not generalised discipline-based learning. From this point of view, we inverted the traditional soil science textbook model and came up with a teaching resource that focuses on issues and topics that are relevant to farmers and the grains industry that were defined by discussions with the farmers and the advisors about the topics that they saw as being most important to the industry. To make this resource available to workers in the industry, it is presented as an electronic book or e-book, which is therefore available on any phone, tablet, computer, laptop or desktop. And the topics within the resource are those defined by the industry as being most significant, such as available water or variability. Stakeholders also made it very clear that the type of learning experiences they wanted were short, sharp and ideally in situ, discussing the problems that they thought were important in any given area. With that in mind, we developed what we called scenario learning experiences, which were to be on-site with the topics defined by local growers or advisors, and very much hands-on experiences. The learning experiences would clearly focus on fundamental soil science knowledge that is needed to understand the various constraints that the growers and advisors presented. The experiential learning scenario process was designed to take the soil science knowledge and have users looking at soils in the field, discussing the various constraints, characterising the soils and trying to relate these fundamental soil science issues to the constraints in question. We have since completed several workshops, the most successful series being on available water and EM measurements in northern New South Wales. The workshops were extremely successful, with 97 participants over 3 workshops giving us extremely good ratings in their feedback surveys. The participants noted that the content was appropriate and that the method was the best one to develop their knowledge of soil science issues related to the constraints in question. One of the most pleasing outcomes from the workshops was feedback from the participants, indicating their appreciation of the soil science knowledge that was presented and their understanding of the relationships between the material and the soil constraints and productivity issues they were having. There was a clear demand for more fundamental soil science knowledge, which convinced us that we had taken the right approach and were developing programs that would work in relating the soil science issues back to the constraints and the concerns of the people on the ground. The teaching model we've developed needs to be expanded to cover different soil constraints in various parts of the country. Ideally, we would move towards some sort of accreditation for the workshop process so that those who chose to could have some professional tick of approval from participating universities or perhaps the Soil Science Society of Australia. Those options are currently being explored. Thank you.
We call soil to the thin layer that sustains life in Earth. Most of our food resources depend on how we use it and how much we care about it. From the big wheat plains to the rice terraces to the horticultural production and all the vegetables that we all eat. If we know how to use it, we can have big benefits from it. In order to grow plants, we need 2 basic elements: soil and water. However, if we don't know how to protect the soil from the water impact, then we start to have some problems. These problems can go from a simple gully to something much worse. So how do we measure how a particular soil behaves in contact with water? We have some ways. The most common one is to measure its aggregate stability. In other words, how a soil aggregate will maintain its structure in presence of water. Here at the Sydney Institute of Agriculture, we take this thing very seriously, constantly trying to understand how the soil behaves using different technologies to measure its multiple characteristics, so we can use this invaluable resource in a sustainable way.
So how do we measure soil aggregate stability in a soil lab? We need 3 things. Basically, this instrument over here, which is a set of pulleys and strings that will hold a sieve, and on top of the sieve we have soil.
The principle behind a structural stability test is very simple. Basically, if a soil aggregate is structurally resistant, this will resist the contact with water by keeping its shape and structural properties. Meanwhile, a soil aggregate that is unstable rather to its chemical or physical properties, it won't resist the contact with water in the same way, so it will break, and as a consequence, it will lose its shape and all the structural properties that it had before.
So what's the issue with this kind of method? Not many farmers have one of these at home, but what most of them have, it's a phone.
Considering the importance of this property of soils, last year we developed a new method that uses some of the basic concepts of soil aggregate stability. Let's suppose that we have a set of soil aggregates and we could measure how they break when submerged in water. If we measure their projected area over time, we could have an idea of how stable are they. We modeled this behavior and we concluded that one of the fit coefficients, in this case our coefficient A in this formula, will represent the maximum area of a soil aggregate after a certain amount of time in direct contact with water. We found out that this coefficient has a clear relation with known soil properties that are always related with fertility and soil functionality, as soil carbon. Expectedly, we also found that this coefficient was higher in those soils that are under crop compared with those in natural conditions. This index was also useful in demonstrating the structural role that plant roots have on stabilizing soil.
So we put all these concepts together and we developed a phone app that is capable to measure the soil aggregate stability in time using the camera of the phone. So in order to measure soil aggregate stability, now you just need, instead of a fancy lab, just a phone, some water, some soil, a petri dish that you can find in many places, and a white background, and something to put the phone on. So I'm just going to use a glass. And that's it, pretty simple.
The interface of the app is a very simple one. We only need to tell the program how many soil aggregates will be involved in the test. In this case, we're going to enter 1. We can also name the project, or we just can skip this part. Once the soil aggregate is placed in an empty petri dish, we can start the experiment. In order to know how much the soil aggregate area will increase in time, we need an initial picture. This is the size of the soil aggregate before breaking. After this is done, we can fill the same petri dish with water and immerse the soil aggregate into the water, immediately followed by pressing the start button. The time needed for a full experiment will be 10 minutes. The camera of the phone will be recording the size of the soil aggregate every single second until the 10 minutes are complete. It will also fit the formula that we presented before, and finally, it will return as a result the fit coefficient A, that will represent the maximum area that our soil aggregate will have after being in direct contact with water. This is basically how unstable our soil is, with a value of 0 equivalent with a very resistant aggregate, and higher numbers equivalent with less structural stability. In this case, the index is 5.5, indicating an average stability.
And as simple as that. So now with just a phone, we have a reliable measure of aggregate stability. There.
So that's it from our SOILinar. I hope you've enjoyed it. We'll see you next year with more exciting stuff. Bye.